to my channel. My name is Holly Starkey, fantasy story editor. I edit all subgenres of fantasy. In today's video, I want to talk about how to start writing when you don't, like maybe you have a vague idea of what you want to write, or maybe you don't really have an idea at all. But this is like the very, very early steps that I recommend people take when they're thinking about starting to write a novel. So since this channel focuses on fantasy, let's pretend that you decided that you want to write a fantasy novel and you don't have anything else after that. So I'm going to do this video in two parts. The first part is going to be like the very, very beginning steps you do, and then the next part will be focused on like your story world and your protagonist and antagonist, just kind of a general advice on how to start. So for how to start, like if you say, I'm going to write a fantasy novel, and after that you have nothing. So the first thing you want to do is you're going to decide on the type of fantasy novel that you want to write. So what I mean is fantasy is a huge genre, just like, science fiction is a huge genre as well. So look at the fantasy genre and decide on where you want to fall into that genre. So for example, you can go to, of course, Amazon website, and I recommend Amazon's website over like Barnes & Noble and Kobo, because Amazon has such a huge list of genres and subgenres there under their fiction category. So I would go ahead and think, okay, I want to write a fantasy novel. If you go to fantasy on Amazon, you can look at all the subgenres. Let's say you see there's going to be epic fantasy with like secondary worlds. You're going to have urban fantasy. You're going to have mysteries. You're going to have a romance under there. And for example, if you want to write cross genre, you want to write a mystery with some fantasy or paranormal elements, you can also go to the mystery section and look under their subgenres. The same applies for romance. If you want to write a romance with elements of fantasy, if you go under the romance section, you have paranormal romance, but then you have romance that focuses on vampires or werewolves or shapeshifters or witches. I mean, you have so many niches within subgenres. So there's a lot to choose from. So I recommend looking at the different subgenres and then the niches there, and to kind of decide on what you want to write in. So once you decide your category, let's say you've decided to write an epic secondary world fantasy novel, you want to also look at the age group. Do you want it to be adult? Do you want it to be a middle grade or a teen, young adult book? So you need to make that decision as well. So when you make the decision, it's going to make it easier when it comes to formulating a plot and working on ideas, because subgenres and different categories have their own tropes and the different reader expectations. So once you've done that, I highly recommend reading some books in your category. I would pick some popular fiction in that category, because you want to pick something that's popular because you know that it has, resonated with a lot of readers who read that type of story. So if you're going to write that epic secondary world novel or that paranormal romance, I would, you can just go to your local library. You don't actually have to go online and purchase all these books. You can go to your library. You can ask a librarian, what are the top 10 books you have in terms of popularity in your paranormal romance or in your urban paranormal mystery books, and look for books that have been published within the last, I would say, 10 years. A book that's 10 years or older, I wouldn't look at that. I would look at a book that's 10 years or younger. Ideally, 5 years are younger in terms of its publication date. So ideally, you want to look at books that are 5 years published, no more than 5 years ago, in terms of looking at popularity and where the genre and subgenre is going, and look at tropes. Of course, it does help to read classics in a particular genre. I always recommend at least reading a couple classics, but you can't really model your novel that you're writing today in 2018 or whatever year it is when you're watching. Maybe it's 2019 in the future, but you don't want to model your novel off of Lord of the Rings, because it's a great series. I love that series, but it's a classic, and there are elements of those stories that aren't really going to work for a modern audience. So definitely look at reading maybe one or two classics in your well, I would say two classics in your genre and subgenre, but also read some contemporary novels like published in the last 5 years or so. And that will really help you in terms of knowing what to write and what the readers expect. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is word count. So you need to have a rough idea of word count expectations in this genre and subgenre, because if you're writing this just for yourself and you're not worried about building a fan base or anything like that, then of course you can write whatever you want. You can write a 25,000 word novel and call it a novel and call it an epic fantasy because you're just writing this for you. But if you're writing this because you want to either, have successful, get a traditional deal, like a traditional book deal, word count is very important with traditional publishing. Or if you're looking at building fans and attracting lots of readers to your work, you want to make sure you're giving them what they expect. So for example, with epic fantasy, I say between like 90,000 to like 110 or so, that's a good range to be in if you're writing an epic secondary world fantasy novel. Remember, if the longer your novel is, like 150 is not too long. There are plenty of novels that have been 150,000 words, but when you start getting these really long novels, like 150,000 words or more, you gotta make sure you have the skill and to keep a novel interesting that is that long. You have to make sure you have enough subplots going on, great characters, an entertaining story world. Also look at the cost of editing. A really long novel is going to cost a lot to edit, and if you're not even looking at editing, you can look at critiquing, because critiquing, most editors offer that. I offer that as well, because it's just more affordable for the writer. But if you're working with beta readers, you necessarily don't want to give them a really, really long novel to beta read, because if they aren't experienced with this, they're not going to be able, it's going to start, the longer the novel gets, the more complicated the editing and critiquing becomes. So if you're not working with a lot of experienced beta readers and you give them some 175,000 word novel, you might not get, great feedback, or it might just be very vague feedback because they can't keep track of all the subplots going on and all the threads to give you that valuable feedback. So that's something to think about as well. So there is a couple resources I want to share. As far as word count goes, there's this great blog post by Reedsy, and Reedsy is this company that has, editors, book cover designers, and some other professionals that are relevant to writers for hire. So you can hire these professionals through Reedsy's website. Reedsy does vet everybody. A lot of these editors are coming out of traditional publishing houses. I will say though that Reedsy is very expensive, so unless you have a decent amount of money to spend, I wouldn't recommend going through them, because they offer, the services are quality, great services, but you are going to spend a lot of money on an editor at Reedsy or a book cover design from Reedsy. But they do have a blog, and that blog, there is this great blog post where they talk about word count, reader expectations, and why word count matters, and I will link to that below. Before I go here, there are a couple resources that I want to discuss for writers to look at. There are organizations that you can go to their webpage. I have some listed here, and I will go ahead and link to them below in the description box, so you can go and visit those websites later. But you have, for example, if you're writing children's books, you have the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators. There's International Thriller Writers. There's, of course, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. You have Romance Writers of America. So there are so many organizations, and most of those organizations, they are, I think all of them actually, cost money to join. I'm not sure how much. I think RWA, Romance Writers of America, is about $100. Now, I'm not sure the requirements for joining, because they all have their own set requirements to become a member. So you can look at that, but a lot of them have blogs that you can read for free. A great resource, especially if you're a fantasy writer or even science fiction writer. The Science Fiction Writers and Fantasy Writers of America, SFWA, yes, SFWA. .org, and I'll link to that below. They have a blog. They have 2 blogs. So if you go to their website and click blogs, you'll see the SFWA blog that has writing advice for writers, obviously writing advice for writers, but advice for how to write a novel and some elements of writing as it pertains to science fiction and fantasy. Also, they have some blog posts about the business side of writing. It's a really great blog to check out, and it is free. You can go ahead and look through there. They also have the Writers Beware. That's a blog that they, not a blog, but a website that they sponsor. And what the Writers Beware does, I have here in my notes, I put down what they do. So Writers Beware offers writers points out literary scams, schemes, and pitfalls, also providing advice for writers, industry news, and commentary. And of course, Writers Beware is sponsored by the Society for Science Fiction Writers and Fantasy Writers of America. And I'll link to all this below so you can go ahead and find that. So that is a great resource if you write fantasy or science fiction. SFWA has some great stuff. And of course, they do have a paid part where you can become a member. But if you can't afford their membership, or maybe you don't meet the requirements, their blogs are free to look at, and you can go ahead and check that out. If you write romance, I have quite a few clients who are romance writers, whether it's like romance in the fantasy genre, like a paranormal romance, or just romance, like contemporary romance. Going to this, Harlequin is a great resource for romance writers. I'm not necessarily recommending them for publishing, because with romance, there's so many readers. I know there's a lot of romance writers, but there are tons of readers, and romance readers read quickly. They will go through so many books. So there's always opportunity for breaking into that business, and you can just make, in my opinion, you can make more money as a romance writer if you're self-published as opposed to being published with a company, unless they're going to offer you some amazing 6-figure book deal. But they have a website called So You Think You Can Write, and it's .com, and of course I'll link to it below. But they have, is ran by Harlequin, but they have information about writers. They have a blog with great tips on writing romance, and it would apply to you if you're writing contemporary romance, sweet romance, paranormal, vampire romance. It is a great resource, and I definitely recommend checking them out as well. So I just wanted to throw out this information for if you're just starting out, some websites you can look at, some societies you can join, some great resources for writing, because as you get, as you're developing what you want to start looking at resources that are specific to you, because general writing advice is helpful. And I recommend it, of course, going to getting some general writing advice. You can get writing books from the library. There's some websites, great websites out there for writing advice. But also look at things that are specific to the kind of story that you're writing, because different genres have, different tropes. And you want to make sure you're hitting some of those tropes, and you make sure you understand what the readers in those genres expect. And the part 2 I'm going to be doing is going to focus more on like the story world and protagonist and antagonist, and some things that you can think about before you start writing to help making that writing process smoother. And look down below in the description box. I'll go ahead and link to all the things I mentioned here, and I'll kind of give an overview of everything that I discussed with you today. So please like, comment, and subscribe. I do writing videos every Wednesday and Friday, and well, Wednesdays and Fridays. So definitely come back for more. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.